This is the Michael Bryan Show. Hi everyone, welcome back to the show, and I am joined with Jen Soriano, who's an award-winning Filipino-American author. Quite the mouthful, Jen. And she's also a musician and mental health expert. So we are discussing trauma, generational trauma, and what we can do about it, if anything. So Jen, thanks so much for joining me.
I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So I wonder where the idea of generational trauma came from, and why do people still think it's a awkward or touchy subject?
Well, I think that people think that trauma in general is an awkward and touchy subject. And honestly, I believe that's because we're just not the greatest in general in the Western world at talking about emotions. And trauma has everything to do with emotions. Now, when you put generational together with trauma, you have a whole other can of worms in that many people don't even know what generational trauma is. It sounds very grand. It sounds grandiose. And some people who might know a bit about what it is or kind of suspect they might be scared of it. So, we're wired to go towards pleasure and things that make us feel good. It's part of what helps us survive. And trauma, by definition, doesn't make us feel good. And then generational trauma, it's like, oh, generations of not feeling good. Why would we talk about this? Why would we, why would we, uh, why would we dwell in this? Let's just pretend it just doesn't exist. That's a natural reflex because of our tendencies toward wanting to reward ourselves and let the reward centers of our brain light up. And there's another aspect, I think, to wanting to avoid the conversation about trauma or even avoid acknowledging that it exists. And I think that comes from habit and survival. And the fact that a lot of generations before us have had to ignore their traumas in order to survive and move on. How many of us might have parents who went through some hard things that we learn about in history books and then don't want to talk about it? That is a survival and coping mechanism in itself, not just because they want to feel good, but because maybe picking themselves up and not looking back on everyone that they lost during a war or Holocaust or famine is part of the way that they then survived to have us as their children or grandchildren. So there is an adaptive reason for not facing trauma and not dwelling in it. But after a certain point, if we don't face it, it comes back to haunt us. And that is one of the reasons that I wrote the book, is to face some of those ghosts and make peace with them.
Do you find that that's probably more important than the trauma itself in terms of like the people that it affects? I mean, it could be two or three generations, if not more, of this same reoccurrence, or possibly trying to avoid it happening again, perhaps as a way of getting through it. Is that more important than the individual trauma itself, who it affects?
I think all of it is important, honestly. There's a term that it comes from Holocaust studies that's called a memorial candle. And I believe that that's a term that comes from a scholar named Marianne Hirsch. And there's a similar concept in Lakota communities, that's a Native American tribe, of someone who bears the burden of historical trauma and realizes that we can break out of the cycle of carrying that burden. And so while a lot of people might be coping and that's a survival mechanism, there's things that come out because of generational trauma that are just frankly bad for our health. So we might be coping, we might be surviving, but generational trauma can lead directly to disproportionate rates of mental illness and also physical disease like diabetes, heart disease, and even cancer. And so, the facing it is not just to um, dwell in the past or to be Debbie Downers or, to shake people out of a coping state, which honestly can be really disruptive. um people are kind of often moving along in a protective shell, and if you rattle that protective shell, um things can start to unravel. Families can start to infight. I think that I've had the experience of trying to rattle that protective shell for some particular family members of mine, and has not gone well. But the reason that it's worth it to folks who are like memorial candles, is that there is a way forward from just carrying this trauma. And that way forward actually looks like really concrete health outcomes that can be very positive, including, mitigating chronic disease that I had mentioned. And in my case, being able to better manage and live with chronic pain.
That's one of the things that I find quite curious is that the events of the past can have very real consequences today. And one of the things that came to mind is the elements of the straw that breaks the camel's back, where you might not be something you've experienced yourself, but we're all carrying little bits of straw, and then all it takes is something that comes up that can then cause the whole thing to suffer and collapse. Is
Absolutely.
it a similar analogy with this? Because obviously, if it's something that's been happening for a while, or maybe something quite, horrific that happened in the past, it
Mhm.
stands to reason that someone in the present moment might not necessarily even know that this is happening, like it's happening to them or for them in some ways, and yet they have no idea what's going on.
Absolutely. Everything you said, 100%. From the straw that breaks the camel's back being a good analogy for how generational trauma that is unresolved and unfaced can eventually break an individual or a family or even an entire community, to the challenge that many folks might not even know about what exactly they're carrying. And here's the hopeful side of all of that, though. Uh, just like we can accumulate the impacts of unresolved trauma, um, we can also cause change in the opposite direction pretty quickly. So, I talk about in my book this pretty exciting neuroscientific research that shows that, not humans, because can't test on humans, but that other types of animals, lab animals, um, who have learned to have developed a traumatic reaction, if you could call it that, to certain things. For example, a rat gets shocked and then exposed to the scent of almond, and then so starts avoiding almond because it associates almond with that trauma of the shock. Those traumatic responses that cause stress can be unlearned within a generation. And when you're talking about the straws that build up that then break the camel's back, for humans, one of the ways you can think about those straws is accumulated dysfunction of our stress response systems to the point that our bodies are in chronic stress, which they're not designed to be, but which can be one of the most common outcomes of unresolved trauma is having a stress response system that is constantly on and constantly flooding your body with hormones. And, so many studies show that stress can be lethal. Those hormones can really lead to all types of chronic diseases and breakdowns in the body and the psyche as well. Now, what do we do about this if, in addition to all the daily stresses that we have in our lives and everything that's building up in our own lived lives, it's then we also have to deal with, oh my God, like this might be my grandmother's trauma as well. That can feel really paralyzing. But here's the thing is that even if we don't know what, we might be carrying from previous generations, that might predispose us to being stressed and triggered by smaller things that other people might not be stressed and triggered by, like the scent of almond in the case of the rat, in the case of descendants of war veterans or people who've been through war. It might be, the car door slamming that they think is a gunshot, even if they've never been in a war themselves. The thing that we can do, even if we don't have those narratives, to connect to our stress responses, is to, number one, have compassion for ourselves and for others who may feel like, why am I so stressed out all the time? Or why am I dealing with all these mysterious health problems? Why am I struggling with my mental health when everybody else seems fine? And we can have compassion and we can have what many trauma-informed people call, practitioners, I should say, call universal regard, which is a way of universally applying the assumption that people may be carrying some generational trauma and unresolved stress. And if that's the case, then we can start from a baseline of again compassion, but then of really taking seriously people's various ailments that may be tied to traumatic stress. We can talk later maybe about then what are some of the ways to then undo those straws to take them off the camel's back.
I wonder what it's actually like for these people. Are you able to share whether it's a real life example or even just something that can help paint a picture for myself and those that are listening in terms of what it could be like to live with generational trauma? You mentioned some things possibly setting you off that wouldn't otherwise set somebody else off. It must feel very strange for them.
Yes, well, and this is why I chose to write my book as a memoir, because I wanted to offer my personal experience as an example of what it's like to live with generational trauma, knowing that, my experience is not universal, but in the specifics of my story, there might be other people who do see similarities in the specifics, but then might also be able to say, oh, well, that's not what happened to me, but I can now see that, for me, it looks like this. And a couple of examples from my own experience are that when I was a kid growing up, I actually grew up quite comfortable. My father was a doctor, and my mother worked for my father's business. And so, we really wanted for nothing in terms of material needs. And yet, for some reason, and we also lived in a very safe part of the Chicago area. But for some reason, I always felt like I was going to die, literally. I didn't think that I was going to live past 17. I just had, and what that looked like was not me waking up every day saying I'm going to die. It just meant like when, for example, as a junior high school kid or a high school kid, people would talk about uh I don't know, getting married and having a family or something like that. I would just think to myself, oh, well, that's not going to happen to me because I'm not going to live past 17. So that is an example of a manifestation of PTSD that actually for me, I eventually discovered was probably inherited PTSD from my ancestors' experiences. That includes my mother and father of war. And another example is is the chronic pain that I've lived with since I was a teenager that had really no easy explanation. I went through 20 years of going to different types of doctors and practitioners, and mostly the diagnosis was it's all in your head. And it really wasn't until I started going to therapy and also started reading some work by Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who is the originator of the term historical trauma. And she is the Lakota scholar who came up with the term I said mentioned before of the people who carry the torch of breaking cycles of historical trauma. And I was able to kind of put together my experiences in therapy with her framework to realize that what I was carrying, both in the chronic pain and in the sort of attitudes that didn't fit my current conditions, like I'm going to die, I have a foreshortened sense of life, that those things always felt bigger than me. They felt like they didn't actually have to do with just what I had experienced in my own life. And so that actually started my healing process around it because it can sound really basic and oversimplified, but it helped me realize that it wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault. And it's like the title of a book that some of your listeners might be familiar with that is called It Didn't Start With You, which is a book about generational trauma by, I think his name is Mark Wolin. Yes. And so that in itself can be healing. It's kind of like the AA Alcoholics Anonymous, you're surrendering to a higher power, but then really still taking responsibility for making changes in your own health.
What was it like when you kind of discovered that it didn't start with you, that it was happening from something that you inherited? What things did you go through? I imagine surprise at first, but what kind of things came up? Did you feel any negative things, any positive things? What did you go through?
I felt a lot of positive things because I had already felt so many negative things in my life. And I felt like I was carrying it all alone. I felt like everything about all those negative things was wrong, was about things that were wrong with me. So once I learned about this framework and also had it affirmed through therapists that I was talking to, it made me feel like everything made sense that, everything that I was carrying, that's why it felt bigger than me, because it is bigger than me. It also made me feel connected to my ancestry. And it broke me out of a very harmful, I think, very American type of hyper individualism that was like mind blowing to me. Like, oh, right. Like, so there's actual science that shows that I'm not just connected to my ancestors by some, abstract concept of love and blood loyalty. I'm actually connected to my ancestors through scientific mechanisms, through through neurological epigenetic changes in my body, through actual cells that get passed on from our mothers, and actually on our fathers too through the sperm, and so it made me just feel like right, it makes sense. Why, if we feel connected to our ancestors because, hey, you have your grandfather's eyes, you have your grandmother's ears, why would we not also be connected through their experiences and psychologically and emotionally how they had been programmed to survive? So I was like, okay, yes, it all makes sense.
Does it work with positive experiences as well? So if we flip the coin slightly, we've got
Mhm.
trauma that's passed down. I imagine things like, heightened cortisol levels, a way of seeing the world, that sort of thing. What about the other way? Do good experiences get passed down as well? Will you have someone that's, generational ecstasy, maybe? just try to think of a different word. Like, how would that work if it does work?
That's great. I love that. Generational ecstasy. I'm going to use that. I'll quote you. And well, so another friend of mine, Valerie Menchavez, talks about transgenerational bravery. And so, that's one of the things that gets inherited as well is, if we have ancestors that are brave enough to, fight and survive through some of the worst conditions, then maybe we inherited some of that as well. In my case, I write about in the book, I write about an inheritance of music being a really, really awesome and ecstatic type of inheritance through my ancestors. And it's also very deeply ingrained in Filipino culture in general. And that has been an incredible healing inheritance. Just being, exposed to music and the practice of music and all of that. But then I also write about just behavior wise, inheriting behaviors that you mentioned two sides of a coin, right? That on behaviors that on the one hand can be maladaptive because we're acting like we're in a war when we're not in a war. But on the other hand, could give us traits that might make us a little bit like X-Men. Like I feel like I have this heightened sense of danger that has really kind of screwed me over a lot in my life because I get, hyper vigilant and, I get very stressed out. But there is also some really good things about it that I'm pretty proud of. Like I think it's actually kind of given me the sixth sense about being a judge of character. I think I'm a really, really good judge of character in terms of, especially being a woman, having to make quick decisions. And I, by the way, little aside, I used to be a travel writer and I used to travel alone. As a woman, I traveled alone, for example, through South Africa and also through Malaysia, and I had to really have my wits about me. I had to have a lot of street smarts. Mind you, I grew up in the suburbs. And I did not have to learn street smarts. In my lived life, I did not have to learn street smarts. But I feel like I have them. And I think I inherited them. I think I got them from my ancestors. And so that kind of sixth sense about danger and about like, can I read this person who's walking down the street, like a quarter mile away from me? Can I read their body language? And I can. And it's kept me safe through some really, really scary situations. And I feel pretty proud of that. And I think it's also helped me surround myself with some really phenomenal human beings.
Does it ever make you think that maybe when you were going through the trials and tribulations of trying to work out what was happening and why it was happening, and were there any instances where you thought maybe it's not necessarily generational, it's just something that's happened from your past personally? What made you think it's definitely not childhood, or when you always hear it in therapy sessions and films where it always goes back to childhood? What made you think that it was further back than that?
Well, I think there were lots of pieces in a puzzle that started to fall into place that pointed towards generational trauma. And that's not to say that, what I actually lived through in my childhood and beyond, it is not part of the picture. It's definitely part of the picture. But if you go back to the camel analogy that you made and the straws, what I realized is that there are straws, maybe I don't know, let's just say half. Let's say half of the bundle of straws that was weighing me down was actually my lived experience. I experienced childhood neglect. I've experienced racism. I've experienced sexism. I have been very close to gender-based violence. And so, there's definitely straws that have accumulated in my own lifetime. But then there were other things that I noticed that then just, by themselves may not have painted the full picture of generational trauma. But together, they did paint that picture. And one of those things I had mentioned before, which is that, that mystery of why would I feel like I was going to die young, when I had a very safe upbringing and materially comfortable upbringing. The chronic pain was another question. Why does this feel so much bigger than myself? And then and I describe in the book a couple situations that could be described as implicit flashbacks, emotional flashbacks, which happens to people with PTSD. They'll have flashbacks, intrusive flashbacks to their moment of the trauma. Except for me, I was having these flashbacks to experiences that weren't mine. I had a flashback where I felt fully in my body like I was experiencing what my grandmother experienced when my grandfather did not come home from the war. And I've always felt very, very close to both my grandmother and my grandfather. My grandfather I never met, but my grandmother I did, and so I feel like that's another thing on the positive side that showed me that there's generational connection, is that I've always really felt like I've carried my grandfather's spirit within me, even though I had never met him. The most convincing piece of the puzzle to me was when I got pregnant and when I had my first child. So the experience that I had with that, and it's something that I was never able to talk about because it was so intense. And I think that's another reason people are afraid to talk about trauma, because it's by definition can be very overwhelming. And so I wrote about it in the book. The short version of it was that I was experiencing extreme delusions around being pregnant and was very, very fearful is not the right word. Fear of pregnancy is common. It was disgust. It was disgust, and it wasn't because of being big or anything like that. It was disgust because of these feelings that did not match my current situation. And I concluded through that basically there's this phenomenon called tocophobia, which is an extreme phobia of pregnancy and childbirth. There is nothing in my lived experience that would have made me feel that way. My mother had 3 kids. I didn't know anybody who lost a child in childbirth. Most of my friends were like the type of of a person who were like glowing goddess mother, like they really wanted to be mothers and they were so excited about it. That and the fact of the intensity of what I was feeling made me realize that this is something that has to do with my ancestors' experience and not mine. And I don't know what that would be. To go back to your first question, I don't have a narrative explanation for exactly why that would be. I don't know what my grandmother experienced during the war. I don't even know all the details of what my mother experienced during the war. But all I know is that for me, when I was pregnant and about to give birth to a child, it felt like going to war in a way that did not seem quote unquote normal. And so that was the last piece of the puzzle that made me realize, oh, right, okay, I am carrying some unresolved trauma that if I heal it, might also heal some of my ancestors' pain.
It must have been quite the experience seeing things through your child as well. Like, do they have similar experiences? I imagine they might be old enough now where maybe things were easier to see, I guess, when they're crying and crawling around the floor, maybe not so easy to see. What kind of things was it like for you to see it through your child as well? Was it a bit more enlightening for you? Did it help you understand things that little bit better?
It's a great question, and gets to another reason that I wrote the book, and might be an inspiration for me writing another book, which is that I wanted to be able to show parents um, some of the things that could show up in kids that might be signs of generational trauma. And again, the whole point of that is not to then label the child like you're generational traumatized, but to have more compassion and then therefore be able to skill up to be able to support children more if they might be exhibiting some of those struggles. So without sharing too much of my kid's business, because that can be a tricky line, I will say that I saw that he had a lot of trouble with regulating his nervous system as a kid. And of course, all kids have that problem. That's part of their development. Some adults haven't figured out how to do that well yet, right? But there are degrees, right? There's sort of a spectrum of what might be regular, child dysregulation and more extreme dysregulation. And I was able to recognize for my son that he needed some extra help with regulating his nervous system because I suspected that he had inherited some of that dysregulation from me. It came out in, for example, like very, very, very physical tantrums of the sort that gets kids in kindergarten, as young as kindergarten, being sent to the principal's office, and then, can actually get kids put into a track of discipline and punishment that some kids may never get out of. And, for me, I think it is one of the greatest rewards of doing the work of healing generational trauma that I think I was able to recognize what was going on with my kid and do the work to get the support that he needed to learn how to regulate, to address sensory sensitivity, so that his own personality could really shine through. And I think for some kids, it can really make the difference between being stigmatized and punished and labeled as the bad kid and kind of thrown away, honestly. And the difference between that and a kid who's actually, cared for and supported, and seen as, not a kid that's acting out, but a kid that has extra needs, possibly because of lived trauma, possibly because of also generational trauma. And that is just a very short version of what trauma-informed parenting can bring about.
Now, I know you may have mentioned it earlier in our conversation as well, Jen, but I wonder what can we do about this? What are some of the things that we can try? Is there anything that can truly help? Because I pictured a world where some of the generational traumas, maybe it goes back a bit too far, maybe there's only ever so much that you can do. What's possible? Where can we take this? What can we do about this?
Oh, there's so much that's possible. And I think, if we look at this model of sociological health, it shows us that there's lots of different levels that we can take action on. And the first level is personal, it is individual. And, it can start with each of us just saying to ourselves, it didn't start with me. And that means I can forgive myself. But it also means I'm going to hold myself accountable to healing. And then the next level is interpersonal. And so that looks like, whatever roles you're in, what kind of support do you need to get, do we need to get to be able to act right in our interpersonal relationships? And for me, that came out in the most challenging way through parenting. How was I going to act right as a parent? How was I going to support my kid to not, so that I was not carrying on the cycle of intergenerational trauma? And so some examples of supports, right, are on the individual level is therapy. It might sound old, but it's an oldie but goodie. Therapy can work. You just have to find the right type of therapist and hopefully have a system that helps you pay for it. And luckily, I'm guessing many of your listeners have that system. And on the interpersonal level, There's family therapy, there's couples therapy, there's community and group therapy. I think that every single person uh uh you know above the age of 3 could probably benefit from some type of therapy, just like we all benefit from exercise. And then the next level is community. In our communities, we got to talk about this more and destigmatize trauma and recognize that we all are carrying it. So why shouldn't we talk about it? Doesn't mean we treat each other like therapists. That's why there's therapists. It means that we treat each other like community and we can help each other hold the burdens of this by, say, referring each other to therapists or just, listening when someone's having a hard day or taking someone seriously when they ask for help. And then there's the institutional levels. So schools, churches, workplaces. There are trauma-informed models and practices for all of these types of institutions. All it takes is a Google search for folks to start to access tools like that. There's been a lot of work done on this. Nobody has to reinvent the wheel. It just takes will to do it. Of hospitals as well. We really need trauma-informed medical care for sure. And then policies and culture shift. So, advocating for mental health policies that actually provide more resources for this type of support for everybody. And then, full circle back to culture is back to, talking about it and destigmatizing it. And that starts with us really individually feeling like we deserve to heal our trauma.
That's actually quite an interesting point, actually, because it made me think, well, we've got already a stigma around therapy, then you combine that with generational trauma alongside all of this. It sounds like it's some of the most uncomfortable conversations that we could have, whether it's family or friends, and then, the idea of referring one of your friends to therapy and call that help, it just seems like a weird way of trying to help someone, especially at first pass as well. Like, that you got your, oh, I've got you a voucher for 2 therapy sessions to heal you, and you think, what? Why would you do such a thing? So you end up having to come up with a better way of having these uncomfortable conversations, or at least trying to make sure that it lands well. There's nothing quite like saying the right thing in your head and they don't think that it is what you've tried to say. And that,
Mm.
that that can make things so much harder, like you say something's round and you think, well, is it a circle or is it an oval or is it some mixture between the two? Well, you just say round because that's all that you know. So how do we do this? How do we have the uncomfortable conversations? Hopefully, more people will get it right than wrong.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you raise a really good point, and that is another reason that we don't talk about it. It's because we feel like we don't have the skills to talk about it in a way that's not going to get messed up. That is partly true, right? And so there is a level of skills building around this that is part of the culture shift. And yeah, having a podcast like this and having people listen to other mental health experts or just regular people that write about their mental health, that's all part of building the skills and how to talk about this stuff. But a really simple principle to start with is the same principle that like my kid had to learn when he had to apologize to someone for doing something that made them feel bad at school. Right? Which is you start with I statements. Is the I statement. The I statement is key to all of this, right? So rather than, getting your friend a couple gift certificates to therapy, you can start with, I, hey, how was your friend asked you, how was your day? I thought about going to therapy today. That might not be true. So but there just might be moments where it could be true or where it's, where maybe you watched a show about therapy and you're like, this was great. Like that show Shrinking. Let's talk about shrinking. I statements that are about like your experience with mental health with talking about pop culture references to mental health, and then also just being curious. Just being curious is another just key principle. So if somebody's feeling bad and you've noticed that they've been feeling bad for 3 months now, you might just want to ask with curiosity. You don't necessarily want to say, I'm going to get you that deal on therapy, but you might want to ask, are you really okay? Is there anything that I can do to help? I've been reading about depression. I'm just wondering if that might be what's going on with you. Hey, like you are, I just noticed that you're really, really upset and agitated right now. I'm going into a trauma response example. I've noticed that you're really upset and agitated, and I can see that just in the way that you really yelled at that person. Like, are you okay? Like, can I help? Like what's going on for you? So I think that there's a way to be curious and use I statements from a place of having a hypothesis, right? Like, is trauma involved here without actually concluding and labeling? So I don't know if that makes sense or is helpful, but I think those are some of the ways that I try to bring trauma and mental health into conversations more often.
It definitely helps, and it makes me think as well that sometimes you can't necessarily force someone to try something. There's an issue that I've seen in some cases where even if you have this conversation and they go, no, I'm not open to the idea of doing this, or maybe it benefits them. Some people get frustrated easily, or anger can sometimes they end up having some kind of benefit from it and they don't want that to go away.
Mm.
It just gets this impression of you can't force someone into something. The old analogy of you can walk a horse to water but can't force it to drink, sort of thing. There's always going to be the last 10% of the thing that they have to take ownership of and do off their own back. Whether they go with someone or do it alone, they still have to walk the last sort of 10 yards to the finish line.
Yes, absolutely. That's always going to be true. And and part of supporting people in their mental health is really respecting wherever people are at with their mental health. Like forcing people to go to therapy, forced institutionalization. Those are all detrimental to mental health. But I think being able to offer options is part of the shifting the culture away from silence and stigma to opening up new paths forward or possibilities toward just a more collective way of encouraging each other to not hold the hard emotional and psychological things by ourselves.
Now, I know as well that there's an element of if we're all carrying this, if we're all having these straws that are passed down from camel to camel, a bit of a strange way of putting it, but if we all have these elements of things that are passed down and make some people more agitated than others, some people have an unusual response to stress or even happiness in some cases,
Mhm, mhm.
if that's the case, then would the solution need to be a bigger solution, do you think? Or do you think working one to one with everyone individually is a way? Like if it's a public health crisis, so to speak, how do we tackle something like that?
Thank you for this question. I mean, this is essentially where my book ends up and was sort of the driving framework for the whole book, which is the fact that many experts believe that trauma is a public health crisis. It affects millions of people, millions and millions of people worldwide. I'm most familiar with the statistics in the US, where in the US, PTSD, well, let's start with the broader statistic, which is that in any given year in the United States, 12 million people are dealing with the effects of unresolved trauma. And so that's just the reported cases, right? And so you can imagine how many more millions are actually affected, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic. We have actually a global public health crisis on our hands because that's just US statistics. Then, if you look globally, right, we're dealing with so many crises, including climate crises and also genocides and, the increasing global inequality, authoritarianism, etc. So, what do we do about the fact that, you know, mass events of trauma are not history? They are still ongoing. One thing that gives me hope is that we are in a place and time where we know more than ever about the science of trauma and how it impacts our health. And this is not just in the United States and Europe. There's actually some really amazing work that I wish I knew even more about that's going on around historical trauma and healing historical trauma in Palestine, for example. And so there's more and more awareness about how we deal with this. And so, yes, the answer to your question is yes. I do think we need a much larger response to this at the level of how global health bodies respond to hunger crises and respond to infectious disease issues. Trauma is something that I would hope could be more and more integrated into and invested in, right, into in public health interventions all over, because it could really help prevent a lot of suffering and save a lot of lives.
So is it purely like a policy thing? Is it we all band together to help one another? Also, I guess being open to help as well, and maybe it's more about the receiver than the giver, because older people try to help, and sometimes it never goes well. So, what do you think it's going to take for the whole society or community that we have to truly get past this?
Hmm. I mean, I'm not sure that we'll ever live in a world where we're truly past it, but I would hope that we can get to a place where we are dealing with it in much more serious and integrated and effective ways, where we could actually even measure, right, the impacts of like the success of trauma interventions. There's other people who are much more versed in this than me who work in this type of field, either in international development, and they have done trauma focused interventions, or people who are medical practitioners, which is like the example that I gave in Palestine, where primary care physicians actually had been trained, a set had been trained in doing intakes that included questions about historical and ancestral trauma. Everything from that sort of interpersonal level of like, hey, let's take it seriously that you might be dealing with generational trauma. Let me ask about it. Even if you don't know the answers, let me acknowledge it. To then, going increasingly out into those outer layers of community institutions and policy. It could take generations, but we need some type of concerted effort like this sooner rather than later to be able to deal with climate trauma, to be honest. So there's quite a bit of urgency around, a more concerted effort to deal with this on a public health scale.
I wonder what you thought would happen if we could. So if people could truly move on from these trauma experiences, past, present, and hopefully future, what would it look like? How would our behaviors change? How would our mindset change? What do you think would be some of the consequences of that?
We would have world peace. I mean, I say that jokingly, but I I tongue in cheek slash there's a grain of truth to every joke. Do feel like the most sort of bloodthirsty, warmongering, hawkish people in the world, I think, actually have a lot of unresolved trauma that they have not dealt with. And I mean that. I actually mean that 100% seriously. Now, of course, there's always going to be power struggles and there's always going to be struggles over resources. But there are battles that happen on the scale of nation states, but also down to the scale of organizations within families, domestic violence, that are perpetuated because of unresolved trauma. So, if we were able to actually heal unresolved trauma, how much more would we be able to deal with difficult situations through means that don't resort first to aggression and violence? I think we would be able to do that much more. We would be able to have much more capacity to find more complicated and peaceful resolutions to battles on all scales. I want that for humanity.
Well, it definitely paints a more positive picture for sure, Jen. I'm really starting to feel like people would be more reasonable and understanding and loads of other words that basically just means more peaceful and happier. This has been a fascinating conversation. I wonder if people wanted to find out more about you, Jen, get the book, which I know is either out now or will be out soon. How can people learn more about you?
They could go to my website, which is jensoriano.net, and they could connect with me on Instagram at Jen Soriano Writes. My paperback actually just recently came out, and people can find it online at places like Amazon. It's called Nervous Essays on Heritage and Healing, and I hope you'll check it out.
Thanks so much for being a guest on the show. Those that are listening, feel free to subscribe, share the show, tell others, and also leave a review wherever you are listening into your podcasts. Jen, it's been amazing. I hope we can keep in touch, and thanks so much for taking the time today.
This was amazing for me too. It was a really fun conversation. Thank you.